The day they came to take her land, Alberta Fletcher was standing in her doorway with flour on her hands and fury in her eyes, and not a single soul in the dusty street of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico Territory, stepped forward to stand beside her, not until one man did. It was the spring of 1883, and the territory was changing. The cattle barons had been consolidating their power for years, swallowing up small homesteads and family operations the way a dry creek bed swallows rain fast, without ceremony, and with nothing left behind. The Dunnmore Ranch was the largest of them all, sprawling across nearly 200,000 acres of grassland, mesa, and river bottom. Cyrus Dunnmore had built that empire through hard work in the early years and through considerably less honorable methods in the later ones. He had lawyers in Santa Fe and friends in the territorial government, and when he decided he wanted a piece of land, he generally found a way to get it. Alberta Fletcher had not started out as a woman who expected to fight anyone. She had come west from Missouri in 1876 with her husband, Thomas Fletcher, who had been a kind and steady man with a dream about raising cattle on a little patch of land near the Rio Salado. They had worked that land together for 5 years, building their herd slowly, weathering drought and bitter winters and the loneliness that came with frontier life. Thomas had died of a fever in the winter of 1881, leaving Alberta with their 8-year-old daughter Nora, a modest herd of about 60 cattle, 3 horses, and a deed to 320 acres that sat right along a stretch of the Rio Salado where the water ran clean and cold year-round. That water was what Cyrus Dunnmore wanted. Alberta was 32 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up during the day and that fell past her shoulders at night. She had green eyes that could be warm as summer grass or sharp as broken glass, depending on what situation required of her. She had calluses on her palms and a straight spine, and a particular quality that people in Harlan's Crossing had come to recognize as determination without recklessness. She was not a woman who looked for trouble, but she was also not a woman who backed down from it once it found her. She had managed the ranch alone for nearly 2 years by the time Dunnmore's men came riding down her lane on that April morning. She had hired 2 hands, brothers named Pete and Callum Rourke, and between the 3 of them they kept the operation going. It was not prosperous. It was not easy, but it was hers and it had been Thomas's, and she had no intention of surrendering it to anyone. The men who rode up were not hired guns, at least not visibly. They were dressed in clean clothes, and the one who came to her door was carrying a leather satchel and had the smooth, self-assured face of someone who had practiced making bad news sound reasonable. His name was Hargrove, and he was Dunnmore's land agent. Alberta listened to what he said. She kept her hands still at her sides, even though they wanted to tremble. He told her that Dunnmore was prepared to offer her a fair price for the Fletcher parcel, that the land was being assessed for water rights, and that she would find herself in a very comfortable position if she accepted before the formal proceedings began. She told him no. He told her she might want to reconsider. She told him she had already reconsidered, and the answer was still no. He left with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a promise that she would be hearing from them again soon, and she stood in her doorway watching his horse disappear down the lane and tried very hard to breathe steadily. That was in April. By the following week, she had received a notice from a territorial court claiming that there was a dispute over the original survey of her property lines. By the end of the month, 2 of her fence posts had been pulled up, and 3 of her cattle had wandered onto Dunnmore land and been impounded. She had to pay to get them back. A week after that, Pete and Callum Rourke came to her with their hats in their hands and told her they were sorry. But they had been offered steady work at the Dunnmore operation, and they could not afford to turn it down, especially given the uncertainty about her situation. She paid them what she owed them and thanked them and let them go without any bitterness toward them, because she understood that men with their own lives to manage could not be expected to tie themselves to a sinking ship. She was alone with Nora and the cattle and the horses and the deed, and a growing sense of dread that she refused to let become despair. It was in early May when things came to a head. Hargrove came back, this time with 4 riders behind him, and a document that he claimed was a court order regarding the water rights dispute. He said that pending resolution of the survey dispute, she was enjoined from drawing water from the Rio Salado above a certain point on her property line, a point that, conveniently, was just below the section of river that fed her cattle troughs and her household well. Alberta did not have a lawyer. She did not have the money to hire one quickly. She had the deed in the house and a letter from the original land office in Santa Fe, and a bone-deep understanding that what was being done to her was wrong, and that the wrongness of it would not be enough to stop it if she could not find a way to fight back. She rode into Harlan's Crossing the next morning to see Judge Elmore Fitch, who was the nearest thing to legal authority in the immediate area. She left Nora with old Martha Beale, who ran the boarding house and who had been kind to her since Thomas died. She tied her horse outside the judge's office and went in. Judge Fitch was a decent enough man, but he was also a practical one. He told her the survey dispute was real in the sense that it had been filed, and until it was resolved, the court order had legal standing. He told her she needed a lawyer. He told her the nearest good one was in Las Cruces, which was 4 days' ride away. He did not tell her anything she did not already know, and he could not tell her that everything would be all right, because he was not sure that it would be. She walked out of his office and stood on the wooden boardwalk in front of the general store and felt, for the first and perhaps only time since Thomas had died, completely and entirely lost. The street was busy that morning. There were ranch hands from various spreads in for supplies, farmers picking up seed, women moving between the dry goods store and the seamstress. There was noise and motion all around her, and she was alone in the middle of all of it, and she was not going to cry about it on a public boardwalk in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, because that was simply not something she was going to allow herself to do. She was standing there composing herself when Hargrove came down the street with his riders, and because life sometimes has a cruel sense of timing, he spotted her immediately and steered his horse toward the boardwalk. He told her, pleasantly enough and in a carrying voice so that everyone in earshot could hear, that he hoped she was giving further consideration to Mr. Dunnmore's generous offer, and that the court proceedings would only become more involved and more expensive if she continued to decline, and that really, for a woman in her situation, with a young daughter to consider, accepting was simply the sensible thing to do. There was a small crowd of people nearby who had paused to listen, the way people do when they sense a scene developing. Alberta looked at Hargrove and at the riders behind him, and at the crowd of watchers, and she felt the full weight of her position. A widow, alone, outgunned in every possible way, being invited publicly to surrender. She straightened her spine and looked Hargrove in the eye and told him that the Fletcher ranch was not for sale, that the survey dispute was manufactured, and that she intended to prove it in a court of law if it took everything she had. Hargrove smiled his practiced smile and opened his mouth to say something further, and that was when a man's voice came from the edge of the crowd. "I'm with her." The voice was quiet but clear, not a shout. Just a statement, delivered with the kind of settled certainty that commanded attention without demanding it. Every head turned. The man who had spoken stepped out of the loose group of onlookers and came to stand at the edge of the boardwalk, and Alberta Fletcher looked at him for the first time, and the world shifted in a way that she would not fully understand until much later. He was lean and tall, with the kind of face that the western sun had weathered into something honest. Not handsome in the way of men who knew they were handsome, but striking in the way of men who had done hard things and come through them intact. He had dark eyes under the brim of a weathered hat, and a jaw that had a few days of dark stubble on it, and hands that were calloused and capable-looking. He wore a plain blue work shirt and trail-worn trousers and boots that had seen considerable miles. He was not armed in any visible way, which made his stepping forward either very brave or very foolish, depending on how you looked at it. His name was Abel McCrae, though Alberta did not know that yet. He was 35 years old, and he had ridden into Harlan's Crossing the previous afternoon and taken a room at the boarding house, and had been intending to pass through on his way north. He had been sitting on a barrel outside the feed store minding his own business when the whole scene had begun to unfold, and he had watched for about 60 seconds before something in his chest decided the situation required him to stop watching. Hargrove looked at him with cool assessment. "You have some business in this matter, friend." "I said I'm with her," Abel said, and there was nothing in his voice that invited argument or explanation. He moved up the 2 steps onto the boardwalk and stood beside Alberta, which meant that there was now one man on foot standing next to one woman in a faded work dress facing 4 mounted riders in the middle of a public street. And somehow, impossibly, the balance of the scene had shifted. Alberta turned her head and looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was something in his expression that she recognized from her own mirror, the look of a person who had made a decision and intended to see it through. "I don't know you," she said, keeping her voice low. "Abel McCrae," he said, "and I know enough of what's going on here to know which side I'd rather be on." Hargrove's smile had thinned. He did not like the change in the atmosphere, but he was not a man who made his living through confrontation, and he was astute enough to read an audience. The small crowd watching was no longer simply watching, people were paying close attention, and the dynamic of a powerful land agent pressuring a lone widow was considerably less comfortable when there was a witness actively naming himself as opposed to it. "The Dunnmore Ranch operates within the full bounds of territorial law," Hargrove said, addressing the street as much as anyone directly. "Mrs. Fletcher has been made a fair offer and given ample opportunity to consider it. That stands whether she has friends vouching for her or not." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was meant to suggest he was above being rattled. "Good day." He wheeled his horse and rode, and his 4 riders followed him, and the crowd dispersed with the quiet murmur of people who had witnessed something they intended to discuss thoroughly later. And Alberta Fletcher stood on the boardwalk in Harlan's Crossing and looked at the man who had stepped out of nowhere to stand beside her. "That was either very kind or very reckless," she said. "Likely both," Abel said. "You don't know anything about my situation." "I know enough," he said again. "Dunnmore's been at this kind of thing for years. I've seen the pattern before in other places. Man wants your water rights." She studied him with the frank assessment she had developed since Thomas died, the ability to read people quickly because she could not afford to be wrong about them. "What is it you do, Mr. McCrae?" "Cattle work mostly. Some surveying. I spent 2 years with a survey crew out of Albuquerque before I went back to ranch work." He paused. "That's why I said what I said. If there's a disputed survey, I might be able to help with it." Alberta was quiet for a moment. The street noise went on around them, and the morning sun was getting warm on the backs of their necks. She was a woman who had learned to be careful about trust, and she had learned to be even more careful about charity that came without strings, because in her experience strings were usually there even when they weren't visible. But there was something about this man that was not offering charity. He had not stepped in to rescue her. He had stepped in to stand beside her. There was a difference, and she felt it, and it mattered. "I'm going back to my ranch," she said. "If you want to tell me more about what you know and what you can do, you can ride out with me and tell me on the way." He nodded once, and they walked to where their horses were tied, and they rode north out of Harlan's Crossing together, and that was how it began. The ride took about an hour. The landscape was the particular kind of beautiful that the high desert of New Mexico does in spring, when the scrub grass was greening and the sage smelled sharp after morning dew, and the mountains in the east held a faint purple shadow against the blue sky. They rode mostly side by side, and Alberta told him the story from the beginning, the deed, the water rights, Thomas dying, the notice from the territorial court, the fence posts, the impounded cattle, Pete and Callum leaving. Abel listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Men who listened without rushing to speak were less common than they should have been. When she finished, he told her what he knew about survey disputes in the territory. He explained that the territorial courts had been used before by large landowners to challenge original homestead surveys, and that the challenge itself, regardless of its merit, could create enough legal fog to make life on a contested property nearly impossible, the goal being to pressure the small owner into selling before the matter ever came to a full resolution. The key, he said, is the original survey documentation. If the survey that Dunnmore's people filed with the court is different from the survey that was done when your deed was recorded, that discrepancy is provable. It's paperwork and measurements, and if the numbers don't match, a judge has to take that seriously. I have the original deed, she said. A deed describes the boundaries. What I need to look at is the original survey plat, the actual measurements and reference markers. Those should be on file at the land office in Santa Fe. And the physical markers on your property, the original stakes or corner stones that the first survey crew set, if those are still in place, they can be measured and verified against what's filed with the court. You know how to do that. I do. Why would you do that for a stranger? There was a pause before he answered, and the pause was honest rather than evasive. She could tell the difference. I've been passing through places for a long time, he said. Watching things happen that shouldn't happen and telling myself it's not my business. There comes a point where that stops sitting right. He glanced at her, and there was a directness in his dark eyes that was not forward or presumptuous, just clear. And you weren't flinching. You were standing there alone, and they were doing everything they could to make you small, and you weren't flinching. That's worth standing beside. Alberta did not have an answer for that, so she said nothing, and they rode the last stretch of road to the Fletcher ranch in a silence that was, surprisingly, not uncomfortable. The ranch was modest by anyone's measure. The house was a solid adobe structure with a covered porch, 3 rooms inside, and a fireplace in the main room that Alberta cooked at and gathered warmth from in equal measure. There was a barn that Thomas had built with pride, large enough for 6 stalls and a good hayloft, though there were only 3 horses in it at present. There were cattle in the near pasture, fewer than there had been. And there was the river, glinting in the distance through the cottonwood trees, alive and cold, and absolutely critical to everything that lived and grew on that land. Nora was at Martha Beale's still, and the ranch had the quiet of an empty house when you knew it should have voices in it. Alberta showed Abel the deed, and the land office correspondence she had kept carefully in a tin box under the floorboards of the bedroom. He spread the papers on the kitchen table and studied them for a long time, asking her occasional questions about which markers she had seen herself, which reference points were visible on the property, what the fence lines followed. "Your original survey is intact," he said at last. "The deed references markers and measurements that are going to be consistent, or I'll be very surprised. What Dunnmore's people have filed has to be fabricated or manipulated somehow, because your water frontage is clearly within your deeded property. The question is whether we can prove the manipulation. Can we?" He looked up from the papers, and in the slant of morning light coming through the kitchen window his face had a quality of steadiness that she found herself wanting to lean on, which was a thing she noted and immediately set aside. She did not lean on people. She had learned not to. "I think so," he said. "I'll need 3 or 4 days to walk the property and take measurements, and then I'll need to get to Santa Fe to pull the original survey plats from the land office records. But yes, I think we can." She crossed her arms and looked at him across the table and the papers and the morning light. "What do you want for this?" He looked back at her without offense at the question. "Nothing. People don't do things for nothing. Maybe I'm not most people," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the single decisive nod that meant she had made a decision and would act on it. "You can stay in the barn. There's a tack room with a cot. I'll feed you. That's what I can offer." "That's plenty," he said, and she almost believed he meant it without reservation. She went to collect Nora from Martha Beals while Abel began walking the property, and when she returned with her daughter, she found him at the south fence line, moving slowly and methodically with a measuring tape and a small notebook, his hat pushed back on his head, and a look of concentration on his face that reminded her, painfully and briefly, of Thomas when he was working out something complicated. Nora, who was 9 years old and had her mother's directness and her father's easy friendliness, looked at the tall man in the field and said, "Who's that?" "His name is Abel McCrae," Alberta said. "He's going to help us with the land trouble." Nora considered this. "Is he a lawyer?" "No." "He knows about surveys." "Is he nice?" Alberta watched Abel crouch down at the fence corner, measuring something, writing carefully in his notebook. "I don't know yet," she said, "but he stepped up when it counted. That's something." The days that followed had a rhythm to them that was quiet and purposeful and strange in the way that new things are always a little strange. Abel rose before dawn, which Alberta knew because she rose before dawn herself and saw the lamp light in the tack room. He worked the property lines during the day, systematic and thorough, and in the evenings he came to the table and ate and shared what he was finding in straightforward terms that assumed she was intelligent enough to follow, which she was and which she appreciated. He did not speak more than was necessary. He did not try to take charge of things that were not his to manage. He fixed 2 things around the ranch without being asked: a hinge on the barn door that had been working loose and a gap in the roof of the chicken coop. And he did it without announcement and without looking for acknowledgement, just as a person does things that need doing when they see them. Nora took to him with the unself-conscious ease of a child who had not yet learned to be guarded. She showed him her drawings, which were remarkably good for a 9-year-old, and told him at length about her 3 horses, naming them and describing their personalities with the earnest specificity that children bring to the things they love. Abel listened to all of it with genuine attention, asking questions and remembering what she said, and Alberta watched this from a careful distance and felt something shift in her chest that she was not yet ready to name. On the 4th evening, after Nora had gone to bed, Alberta and Abel sat at the kitchen table with the documentation he had compiled: precise measurements, reference points, photographic notes made in careful script, and went over everything. "Your fence lines are exactly where the original deed says they should be," Abel told her, spreading his notes alongside the deed and the land office letters. "Every monument I can find corresponds to the original survey. Now I need to get to Santa Fe and pull the original plat, but I am almost certain what I'm going to find is that the survey Dunnmore's people filed with the court has altered the position of the southern boundary, the one closest to the river, by enough to exclude your water frontage from your title." "By how much?" "I'd estimate between 40 and 70 feet, based on where their court filing places the line versus where the physical markers actually are." Alberta was quiet, doing the math. "That's the difference between having water rights and not having them." "Yes, and you can prove the discrepancy. With the original Santa Fe records, yes, absolutely." He leaned back and something in his expression shifted, not uncertainty, but something more personal, less professional. "I need to make the trip to Santa Fe, 4 days there and back if I push. While I'm gone, I'd feel better if you weren't here alone." "I've been here alone for nearly 2 years," she said, and it came out a little sharper than she intended. He did not flinch from it. "I know you have," he said calmly. "That's not what I meant. I meant that Dunnmore knows you're resisting, and now there's a stranger on your property helping you, and men like Dunnmore don't like that. They might do something to make things more difficult before a legal challenge can be mounted." She had already thought about this herself. She had just not wanted to think about it too directly because it led to places that were frightening. "What do you suggest?" "Tell Judge Fitch what you're doing. Tell him you have documentation in progress. Have him put a note in the court record that you are preparing a legal response. That way, anything that happens to your property while I'm gone becomes part of the record." He paused. "Is there anyone you trust in town? Someone who could check in on you?" She thought about Martha Beale, who was 63 and formidable and had no patience for Dunnmore or anyone associated with him. "There's Martha. She'd come if I asked." "Good, ask." He looked at her steadily, and the lamplight made his features quiet and serious. "I don't want anything to happen to this place while I'm trying to get the means to protect it." There was something in the way he said it, "this place," that moved her unexpectedly, because it was not his place and he had known them barely 5 days, and yet the way he said it carried a weight of investment that was real rather than performed. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a challenging one. Abel was quiet for a moment. The lamp flickered once, steadied. Outside the window, the spring night was making its various sounds: a nighthawk, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft sigh of wind in the cottonwoods. "My father had a place in Texas," he said slowly. "Not unlike this. He built it himself, and a man with more money and more lawyers decided he wanted it, and when I was 17 we lost it. Not to violence, just to paperwork, the way these things usually go. My father never quite got back on his feet after that." He paused. "I spent a long time moving around after that, working other men's land, watching the same thing happen to other people." He looked at her directly. "You shouldn't lose this. It's yours and you earned it, and the people trying to take it have done nothing to deserve it." Alberta held his gaze for a long moment. The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry about your father's land," she said. "So am I," he said simply. She rose to clear the table, and he helped her without being asked, and when the dishes were done and the lamp was low, she said good night and watched him walk across the yard to the barn, and she stood in her doorway longer than she needed to, watching the light come on in the tack room. She was not falling in love with him. She was not ready for that. Thomas had been gone less than 2 years, and the ground of her heart was still tender in the way of a field after a hard winter, capable of growing things again, but not yet. But she was beginning to trust him, and after 2 years of managing alone, trust was not a small thing. Abel left for Santa Fe the next morning at first light, and he made the 4-day journey in 3.5, pushing his horse harder than was comfortable on the return leg, because something in him was reluctant to be away from the Fletcher ranch longer than necessary. He told himself it was professional investment in the case. He knew, somewhere quieter and more honest than his professional self, that it was not only that. He found what he expected in the land office records in Santa Fe. The original survey plat for the Fletcher parcel was on file and intact, and it showed the southern boundary of the property running along a line that included, clearly and unambiguously, the full water frontage that the Dunnmore filed court document had displaced. The discrepancy was 46 feet, that stood between Alberta Fletcher and her right to water her cattle and her household from the river that ran through her land. He had a copy made by the land office clerk, paid for it, and stored it carefully in his saddlebag with the other documents. On the road back, he turned over what he knew and what would need to happen next, and he found himself thinking about Alberta, not about her legal situation, but about her specifically. About the way she listened. About the quiet courage she wore like it was ordinary, because to her it had become ordinary, which was a different kind of courage than the dramatic kind. About the way she had asked him what he wanted for his help, direct and unashamed, because she had learned that the world required directness. About Nora showing him her drawings and Alberta watching from across the yard with that careful, measuring look that was also, underneath its carefulness, something that could be warmth. He had moved through the world for a long time without putting down roots, and he had told himself that was by choice, and maybe it was, or maybe it was easier than building something that someone could take away again. He was 35 years old, and there was not a place in the world that he could call his, and riding back toward the Fletcher ranch in the red light of a late afternoon, he was aware of that with an acuity that surprised him. He arrived back on the evening of the 4th day. Alberta was on the porch when he rode in, and the way she straightened at the sight of him, not dramatically, Just a subtle release of something held told him that she had been worried about more than the legal documents. "You're back," she said. "I'm back, and I have what we need." He spread the documents on the table again, this time with the Santa Fe plat alongside his own measurements, and walked her through the comparison point by point. The discrepancy was plain and clear even to an eye untrained in survey mathematics. The numbers simply did not match, and the physical markers on her property confirmed her original deed, not the document Dunnmore had filed. "This is fraud," Alberta said. Her voice was level, but her hands were not entirely steady as she turned the pages. "Yes, deliberate and documented." He tapped the Santa Fe copy. "This is a certified copy from the Territorial Land Office. It supersedes anything filed afterward. Any competent judge looking at this alongside my measurements is going to see exactly what happened." "Judge Fitch isn't Dunnmore's man," Alberta said, thinking it through. "He's not brave, but he's not corrupt. If we put this in front of him formally, with everything documented, he has to act on it. He does. And if he doesn't, this goes to the territorial court in Santa Fe, where it will make Dunnmore's lawyers very uncomfortable because fraud in a land filing is a criminal matter, not just a civil one." Alberta was quiet for a long moment looking at the papers. Then she raised her eyes to him and said something that was not about the documents. "You came back faster than you said you would." He met her gaze. "I didn't want you worrying longer than necessary." "I don't worry easily." "No," he agreed. "But you were worried." She looked at him for a moment more, and then something shifted in her expression, a fractional softening, barely visible unless you were paying close attention, which he was. "I'll ride in to see Judge Fitch tomorrow," she said. "Will you come?" "Yes." "Good." Nora appeared in the doorway of the back room in her nightgown, having apparently been listening, because she said, "Did you get the papers that prove Mama's land is hers?" "I did," Abel said. Nora nodded with great seriousness. "Good. I prayed about it." Alberta said, "Nora, you should be asleep." "I know," Nora said serenely, and disappeared. Abel's mouth curved at one corner in a way that was not quite a smile but was close to one, and Alberta caught it, and something warm moved through her that she did not examine immediately. She thought about it later, lying in the dark, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge what it was even if she was not ready to do anything about it. They rode into Harlan's crossing the next morning, all three of them, because Nora had made it clear that she intended to be present for the occasion, and Alberta did not have the heart to argue with her about it. Martha Beale met them on the boardwalk in front of the judge's office and said she intended to come in as well, because she had not liked the look of those Dunnmore riders the previous week, and she wanted to see how Judge Fitch responded to good documentation. Judge Fitch was a man of about 50, gray and careful, who had seen enough of the territory's legal battles to develop a strongly pragmatic approach to evidence. He took the documents from Abel and spent 20 minutes studying them in silence, his reading glasses on, while Alberta and Abel sat across from him, and Martha stood by the wall with her arms folded, and Nora sat in a corner chair doing her best to appear invisible. When Fitch looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, in the way of a man who was making sure his face did not commit him to anything before his words did. "These measurements are your own work?" he asked Abel. "They are. Done over 4 days with a standard chain and compass, cross-referenced against the deed descriptions and confirmed at 4 of the original survey corner monuments. And the Santa Fe copy is certified. The land office stamp and the recording clerk's signature are both on the document." Fitch set the papers down and took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. "This is a serious matter," he said. He said it with the weight of a man who understood exactly how serious and who was, perhaps, not entirely pleased to be the one who had to deal with it. "Yes, it is," Alberta said. "The survey filed with this court by Dunnmore's agent is fraudulent. I'd like that on the record." Fitch looked at her for a moment, and then at Abel, and then back at Alberta. "I'll be issuing a stay on the current court order regarding your water rights, effective immediately. And I'll be forwarding this matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office, which is what's required when fraud is alleged in a land filing." He paused. I'll also be sending a communication to the Dunnmore Ranch informing them that this matter is now under investigation. And the survey dispute case, Alberta asked, dismissed with this documentation on the record. Fitch put his glasses back on and began writing, which was his way of signaling that the meeting was concluded. Mrs. Fletcher, your land is your land. The water rights stand as deeded. Outside on the boardwalk, Martha Beale said, "Well, that's that," with considerable satisfaction, and hugged Alberta briefly and firmly in the way of a woman who expressed affection in practical and definite terms. Nora said, "I prayed about this one too." Abel stood slightly apart, and Alberta turned to look at him in the spring morning light, and everything that had been held at a distance for weeks, the measured gratitude, the careful trust, the thing she had not let herself name, was very close to the surface. "Thank you," she said. The words were insufficient, and she knew it. "You didn't have to do any of this." "I wanted to," he said. It was simple and direct and entirely true, and it was also, they both understood, about more than the legal documents. Martha Beale, who was not a woman who missed things, chose this moment to announce that she and Nora were going to the general store because she needed sugar, and took Nora firmly by the hand, and they departed. Alberta and Abel were standing on the boardwalk in the warm morning, and the street went on around them, and neither of them spoke immediately. "What will you do now?" Alberta asked. She asked it neutrally, keeping her voice steady, but it was not a neutral question, and they both knew it. Abel looked at her directly, fully, without the careful distance he had been maintaining. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what you want me to do." Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She was 32 years old, and she had been married and widowed, and had run a ranch alone and fought a powerful man's legal machinery with nothing but good documents and a stranger's courage. And she was not a woman who was small about her own feelings, but this particular feeling was large in a way that required care. "I don't want you to leave," she said. It was as honest as she could be in a public street. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, but completely, the way a landscape changes when the sun clears the ridge. "Then I won't," he said. They stood there for another moment, close and not touching, with the warm spring air between them and the whole vast territory around them. And Alberta thought that this was perhaps the most significant conversation she had ever had in 4 short sentences. They walked to the general store together to collect Nora and Martha, and when they rode home that afternoon the light was golden and the sage was fragrant, and the 3 of them rode abreast with Nora in the middle talking about everything and nothing. And Alberta looked across her daughter's head at Abel and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away. In the weeks that followed, Abel stayed. He was sleeping in the tack room and working the ranch, and it was understood between them without being stated that this was a temporary arrangement only in the technical sense, that what was building between them was not temporary, and both of them knew it, even as they were careful and unhurried about it in the way of 2 people who had each been burned by loss, and were not reckless about new and important things. He was good at the ranch work. He had spent enough years doing it that it was in his hands and his back, the knowledge that does not need to be thought about because it is simply part of how you move through the world. He and Alberta worked side by side through the lengthening spring days, and they really talked, in the way that people do when they are building understanding of each other. He told her about Texas and about his family and about the years of moving that had followed his father's loss of the land. She told him about Missouri and about meeting Thomas and about what those 5 years of building together had meant, and what it had meant to lose him and what it had taken to keep going after. He listened to all of it without trying to fill the space of Thomas with himself. He understood that Thomas had been real and important and was part of who Alberta was, and he had no interest in erasing that or competing with it. He was offering something different, not a replacement, but a future, and Alberta felt that distinction clearly and was grateful for it. Nora, meanwhile, had adopted Abel with wholehearted, uncomplicated enthusiasm. She showed him everything, her drawings, her favorite spots along the river, the peculiarities of each of the 3 horses, the best place to find horned lizards in the afternoon heat. Abel received all of this information with patient genuineness and showed her things in return: how to read weather from cloud formations, how the survey compass worked, how to find south from the stars on a clear night. Nora absorbed everything with the serious eagerness of a child who found the world endlessly interesting. On an evening in late May, Alberta and Abel were sitting on the porch after Nora had gone to bed, listening to the night sounds, and the temperature was the perfect temperature of late spring on the high desert when the day's heat has eased, and the coolness coming down from the mountains is just enough to make the air feel alive. They had been talking about the Territorial Attorney General's investigation, which was proceeding Dunnmore's land. Agent Hargrove had already been questioned, and there was talk in town of a larger investigation into the land filings Dunnmore had made over the past several years. It was not resolved yet, but the trajectory was clear, and Alberta's land was no longer in dispute. And then they had stopped talking about that and talked about other things, and then stopped talking altogether, and the silence was the kind of silence that has its own weight and warmth. "I haven't felt settled anywhere in a long time," Abel said, to the night rather than to her directly. "Are you settled here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I am when I'm with you," he said, "which makes it complicated because I'm on your property in your tack room and I haven't said any of the things I probably should say, and I don't want to presume." Alberta turned her head and looked at him in the faint light from the lamp inside. "You stepped out of a crowd of strangers and stood beside me," she said. "That's not a small thing to presume on." He turned to look at her too, and the distance between them on that porch in that moment was not large. "No," he said, "it's not. I'm not ready to rush anything," she said carefully. "Thomas has been gone less than 2 years. Nora is still—" she paused. "I'm still finding out what I am when I'm not grieving." "I know," he said, and he meant it not as a polite acknowledgement but as a real statement of understanding, because he had watched her through these weeks and seen the process of it, the way she was becoming more fully herself again, not less like who she had been with Thomas but more completely who she was on her own. "But I don't want you to leave," she said again, and this time it meant more than it had on the boardwalk in Harlan's crossing. "I won't," he said again, and this time it also meant more. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and found her hand in the dark, and she let him take it, and they sat like that for a long time, holding hands on the porch of the ranch that was hers and was going to stay hers, listening to the nighthawk and the river and the wind in the cottonwoods, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Summer came, and with it the fullness of ranch work in the long days, the cattle to manage, the hay to cut, the fences to maintain, the 100 tasks that a working ranch requires. Abel had moved from the tack room into a proper room by then, the small second bedroom that had been used for storage, and there had been a brief and serious conversation between him and Alberta about the propriety of it and what it meant, and the conclusion of that conversation was that what it meant was that he was a member of the household and that propriety could attend to itself, because both of them had more important things to worry about. The town knew, of course. Towns always know. Harlan's Crossing discussed the situation at Martha Beale's table and over the counter at the dry goods store and along the fence rail at the livery, and the general consensus, arrived at through the democratic process of collective opinion, was that Alberta Fletcher had done well for herself in the man department, and that the timing might be a little fast but that life in the territory had a way of making things move faster than they might elsewhere, and that in any case Mr. McCrae had stood up when it counted, which spoke to his character. The Dunnmore situation continued to develop through the summer months. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation expanded, and it became clear that the fraud on the Fletcher property had not been an isolated incident. Hargrove had filed manipulated surveys on at least 4 other properties on behalf of Dunnmore over the preceding 3 years. two of which had already been sold under pressure, and two of which were still being contested. Cyrus Dunnmore, who had spent years building his empire with the comfortable assumption that his money and his connections would insulate him from consequence, found himself in the unprecedented and deeply unpleasant position of being named in a territorial criminal proceeding. His lawyers from Santa Fe came, and they managed to settle two of the other cases quietly and expensively, but the Fletcher case, being the one that had started the investigation, was harder to make disappear. Alberta was offered a financial settlement from Dunnmore's people in August, a sum that was more than the property was likely worth in cash, to be accompanied by her agreement to withdraw from the legal proceedings. She declined. Abel was with her when she met with Dunnmore's lawyer, a carefully dressed man from Santa Fe who had the air of someone who expected to be persuasive. And the lawyer made his offer and Alberta declined it. And when the lawyer asked what it would take to reach a resolution, Alberta said what she wanted was the full formal dismissal of the survey fraud case with Dunnmore's acknowledgement of responsibility on the public record. The return of the two properties that had been acquired through fraudulent surveys with fair compensation to their former owners, and a permanent injunction preventing Dunnmore's operation from filing any further legal challenges to her property. The lawyer looked at her for a long moment and said that was a very comprehensive list. Alberta said she understood that and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the Attorney General's proceeding to produce that result if Dunnmore was unwilling to agree to it voluntarily. The lawyer looked at Abel, perhaps hoping to find someone more malleable, and Abel met his gaze with calm neutrality and said nothing, because this was Alberta's matter and her decision, and she needed no one to speak for her. The lawyer went back to Dunnmore. By September, a settlement agreement had been reached that contained the public acknowledgement of the survey fraud, the compensation and deed restoration for the two other affected properties, and the injunction Alberta had requested. Cyrus Dunnmore signed it, presumably with considerable displeasure, and the event was noted in the territorial newspapers, including a brief item in the Santa Fe paper that mentioned Mrs. Alberta Fletcher of Harlan's Crossing by name as having brought the initial challenge. On the afternoon that word reached Harlan's Crossing that the agreement had been signed, Martha Beale organized what could only be described as a celebration, though Martha herself called it a gathering, because she was not a woman who admitted to organizing celebrations. It was held at the boarding house and involved a remarkable amount of food, and most of the people in town who had decent opinions of Alberta, which was most of the town. Alberta sat at the table surrounded by her neighbors and watched Nora eat 3 pieces of pie and talk at full speed to anyone who would listen, and felt something that she identified, after a moment of consideration, as happiness. Not the fragile kind that you hold carefully because you know it can be taken, the other kind, the solid kind that has been tested and confirmed, the kind that belongs to you. Abel was across the table, talking with Judge Fitch about something, and he looked up and found her watching him, and the corner of his mouth lifted in that almost smile that she had learned to read as the outward expression of something much larger going on inside him. She smiled back at him, fully and without reserve, for the first time since she had known him, and his expression changed entirely, warmly, completely. And Judge Fitch apparently noticed because he said something low that made Abel's ears go slightly red, which Alberta found unexpectedly delightful. After the gathering, after Nora had been put to bed and Martha Beale's house was quiet, Alberta and Abel walked home through the autumn night, leading their horses because the night was fine and they were not in a hurry. The stars over New Mexico in September are extraordinarily thick and bright and close-seeming, the whole of the Milky Way spread across the sky like something impossibly generous. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Abel said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "I want to know if I can court you properly," he said, openly and honestly, with the intention of with serious intention, not just staying and working the ranch. with the intention of asking you something more important later when you're ready for it." Alberta stopped walking. They were in the middle of the road, which was empty in both directions, and the starlight was bright enough to see by. "You've been staying in my house all summer," she said. "I know, but I want to do it right. You deserve someone who asks properly." She looked at him in the starlight, this man who had stepped out of a crowd of strangers to stand beside her and had stayed, and had done every hard thing without complaint, and had held her hand on the porch, and had not pressed for more than she was ready to give, and who was now standing in the middle of a moonlit road asking her permission to court her. "Abel McCrae," she said, "you have been courting me for 5 months. I think we've established that." He was quiet for a moment, and then a sound came out of him that she had never heard before, a real laugh, low and warm and genuine, and it lit something in her chest that had been waiting for exactly that sound. "I suppose we have," he said. "Ask me your more important question," she said. "Not tonight, but when you're ready, I'll be ready too." They walked the rest of the way home under the stars, and his hand was in hers, and the future had a shape to it that felt solid and true. Autumn on the high desert was her favorite season. The cottonwoods went gold, brilliant and brief, and the light went amber in the afternoons, and the air had a sharpness that felt like clarity. The cattle were fat from a good summer's grazing, and the hay was in the barn, and the ranch was, for the first time since Thomas died, not just surviving but genuinely thriving. Abel had been doing more than managing the existing herd. He had spent the summer building relationships with a couple of neighboring ranchers, men who respected his practical knowledge, and who had been inclined to help once Dunnmore's grip on the area had begun to loosen. There was talk of a cooperative arrangement for the spring cattle drive, combining herds from 3 small operations so they could negotiate better prices at the railhead in Las Cruces. It was the kind of thing that would make the difference between scratching out a living and actually building something. Alberta had watched all of this and participated in it, and she had come to understand something important, that Abel's arrival in her life had not reduced her. He had not come in and taken over or managed her into a corner. He had come alongside her and stayed alongside her, and the result was not that she needed him to manage the ranch. The result was that together they were building something larger than either of them could have built alone. That was the thing she had been afraid of, she realized. That depending on someone again would mean becoming less. Thomas had been a good man and she had loved him, but their partnership had always felt slightly unequal. She had managed the house and the accounts and the smaller decisions while he made the large ones, and after he died, she had discovered capacities in herself that she had not known were there, or not known how fully they were there. She did not want to hand those capacities back, but Abel had never asked for them. He offered his and respected hers, and treated the whole thing as a partnership between equals, which was so different from what she had expected that it had taken her months to fully trust it. On a Sunday afternoon in October, when Nora was at Martha Beale's for her weekly visit, and the ranch was quiet in the golden afternoon, Abel came in from the barn and found Alberta at the kitchen table with the account ledgers, which she kept precisely and carefully as she kept everything. He washed his hands at the basin and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her without being asked. She looked up from the ledger. "Thank you." He sat across from her and looked at her with the full direct gaze that she had gotten used to and still felt deeply whenever it was directed at her. "Alberta," he said. She set her pen down. "Yes." He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the table between them, and she looked at it. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small green stone that was not an expensive stone but was a pretty one, the color of spring grass or perhaps of her eyes. It was not new. It had the look of something that had been carried for some time. "That was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when she died and told me to give it to someone worth giving it to." He paused. "I've been carrying it for 8 years." Alberta looked at the ring and then at him, and 8 years was a long time to carry something and wait for the right person, and she understood that in a way that went very deep. "I know it hasn't been a year since I walked up to you on that boardwalk," he said. "I know you might say it's too soon, and if you do, I'll wait. I will wait as long as you need. But I mean to spend the rest of my life here with you and Nora if you'll have me, and I wanted to ask you before I lost my nerve entirely." Alberta reached out and picked up the ring from the table. It was warm from being in his pocket, warm from being carried for 8 years. She held it for a moment and felt the weight of it, which was not heavy at all. "You stepped out of a crowd of strangers," she said quietly, "and stood beside me when you had no reason to. You walked my fence lines for 4 days and rode to Santa Fe and back in 3 days because you didn't want me worrying longer than necessary. You fixed my barn door without being asked. You listened to Nora talk about her horses for an hour and asked every right question." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright. Though she was not crying, she was smiling. "You held my hand on the porch in the dark and didn't ask for more than I was ready to give." "Alberta," he started. "Yes," she said simply. "My answer is yes." He let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time, and then he was around the table and she was standing, and the ring was on her finger where it fit as though it had always belonged there, and he kissed her for the first time, finally, properly. And it was not a tentative kiss but a full and certain one, the kind that means something has been decided, the kind that has the weight of a future in it. She kissed him back with equal certainty, and when they stopped, her hands were on his chest and his were around her, and the afternoon light was golden in the kitchen, and outside the cottonwoods were brilliant gold through the window. "8 years is a long time to carry a ring," she said. "It took me a long time to find the right person," he said. She put her head against his shoulder briefly with the quiet luxury of a woman who has earned rest and knows it. "You did find the right person," she said, "in the most dramatic possible way." "I stepped out of a crowd," he said, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. "You stepped out of a crowd," she confirmed. They were married in December, in the small church in Harlan's Crossing, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by everyone in town who could get there. Martha Beale cried without any acknowledgement that she was doing so. Nora, who was the most important witness, stood very straight and serious through the whole proceedings, and then burst into enormous joy the moment the final words were said, and flung herself at Abel with such force that he nearly staggered, and caught her and held on. Judge Fitch, who was not known for sentimentality, shook Abel's hand afterward and said gruffly that he was a lucky man, and Abel said he knew it. In the years that followed, the Fletcher Ranch, which became, in the quiet way of things, the McCrae Ranch, though Alberta never entirely stopped thinking of it as hers in the original way, and Abel never expected her to grew. The cooperative cattle arrangement Abel had put together with the neighboring ranchers proved profitable, and they added to the herd and improved the pasture, and in the spring of 1885 they built a second barn that was substantially larger than the first. In the summer of that year, their son was born. They named him Thomas Abel McCrae, Thomas for the man who had built the foundation of what they now lived on, and Abel for his father. He came into the world with a fine pair of lungs and dark eyes exactly like his father's, and Nora declared herself his appointed protector from the first hour, and demonstrated this by not letting anyone hold him for an unreasonable stretch of time. Alberta, lying in the bedroom on a summer afternoon with her son in her arms and Abel sitting beside the bed holding her hand, felt the full weight of the life she had built twice, in different ways, and the second time from a harder starting place. Thomas Fletcher had given her Nora and 5 good years in this land. Abel McCrae had stepped out of a crowd and given her back the land and a future she had not dared to imagine, and was giving her more of it every day. "Thank you," she said to Abel, meaning many things. He pressed a kiss to her temple with the gentleness he had for these private moments. "Thank you," he said back, meaning all the same things in return. Little Thomas grew with the easy confidence of a child surrounded by love. He had his father's quiet steadiness, and his mother's green eyes, and his sister's stubborn insistence on his own opinion, which made for interesting years. Nora, for her part, grew into a young woman with her mother's directness and her father's capacity for careful thought, and she had a talent for drawing that Abel encouraged in every practical way, tracking down sketchbooks and good pencils from the supply merchants in Las Cruces with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. The Dunnmore matter was fully resolved by 1886. Cyrus Dunnmore, facing the full consequence of the territory's legal proceeding, was required to surrender significant portions of land that had been acquired through fraudulent means. The Dunnmore operation continued on a smaller scale. It was still the largest ranch in the territory, but it had been compelled to a degree of accountability that had not existed before, and the families whose properties had been taken through manufactured survey disputes were, to the extent possible, made whole. It was not a perfect outcome. The territory was still a place where powerful men had advantages that smaller ones did not, and where the law could be bent by wealth and connection. These were facts of life in 1886 New Mexico, and Alberta knew them and did not pretend otherwise. But things had shifted, and the shift had begun on a boardwalk in Harlan's Crossing when one man had stepped out of the crowd. She thought about that sometimes, the contingency of it. If Abel had been on the other side of town that morning, if he had been passing through on a different day, if he had looked at the situation and decided it was not his business, the whole shape of things would have been different. "Do you think about how you almost didn't come into town that day?" she asked him once, on a winter evening by the fire, Thomas asleep in the cradle and Nora reading at the table. Abel looked at her with the warmth that was fully visible in his face now because he had stopped managing it. It simply was there when he looked at her, and had been since somewhere in that first summer. "I think about it," he said. "I think I was always going to. I just didn't know it yet." "That's a very neat answer." "It's a true one," he said. "Whatever I was looking for when I left Texas 17 years ago, I found it here. I just had to take long enough to get here that you'd have the ranch built and ready." She threw a piece of bread at him, which he caught without looking. Nora looked up from her book and said, "Are you two being romantic? Because if so, I'm going to go to bed." "Go to bed," Alberta said. "Good night," Nora said, without any injury, and kissed both of them and disappeared. In the spring of 1887, a second child arrived, a daughter, this time dark-haired and imperious from the first hour. They named her Alina, after Abel's mother, whose ring had traveled 8 years to find the right finger. Alina arrived already knowing what she wanted and communicating it without ambiguity, a quality that Alberta found both highly familiar and deeply satisfying. Thomas, at not quite 2 years old, regarded his sister with philosophical acceptance, and when he was old enough to move under his own power, he became her dutiful shadow, following wherever she led with the patient loyalty that would characterize their relationship for decades. The ranch in those years was busy and full in the way of a place where things are growing. The morning started early with the particular sounds of a working ranch. The horses in the barn, the cattle in the near pasture, the dogs that had accumulated over the years doing their loud opinions about the world. Alberta made the coffee and checked the accounts, and rode out on morning inspection with Abel because they had done that since the beginning and saw no reason to stop. The evenings wound down slowly, with supper and the children and the fire, and eventually the quiet of two people who had chosen each other and were not done making that choice. Because, in Alberta's experience, that was what love in a working life actually was, the ongoing choice, made every day in the small things. In the autumn of 1888, Nora turned 14 and announced with complete calm that she intended to study art someday, perhaps in Santa Fe where there was a school, and that she was not in a hurry but wanted everyone to know her intentions. Alberta looked at her daughter, this girl who had watched her mother stand on a boardwalk and refused to flinch, who had said calm prayers about survey documents and welcomed a strange cowboy into her home without reservation, and felt a pride so large it was almost painful. "We'll find a way," Alberta said, and meant it. Abel, who had already been quietly looking into the Santa Fe school for a year without telling anyone, said, "I know people in Santa Fe we can write to." Nora looked at him with the expression she had used since she was 9 years old for when he did something she had expected him to do. "I know you already know," she said. "I know you know I know," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said, and went back to her drawing. Alberta looked at Abel across the table. He looked back at her, and the lamplight was warm, and outside the autumn night was doing what autumn nights in New Mexico do, wide and clear and smelling of sage and cold air coming down from the mountains, and the life they had built was all around them. In the sound of the children, in the warmth of the house, in the solid permanence of land that was theirs without dispute, in the ongoing daily proof that the world could be as good as you were willing to fight for it to be. "I love you," she said, because she had learned to say it straight out rather than sideways, in the years since she had learned to trust it. "I love you," he said back, the same way, straight out and without ornamentation, because that was who they were. She reached across the table and found his hand the same gesture, mirrored from that first porch in the dark, and they sat by the fire in the warmth and the light, and the life they had made together went on around them, whole and real and entirely their own. The years accumulated the way years do when life is well lived, not dramatically, not in great turning point moments, but in the accumulation of days that are full of the right things. The ranch grew. The children grew. The cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranchers expanded until it included 5 operations and had become one of the most productive small cattle ventures in the Southern Territory. Abel's reputation as someone who could read a survey and find the truth in one became well known enough that 2 other families in contested land situations came to him for help over the years, and he gave it, and both situations were resolved in the family's favor. Alberta kept the accounts and managed the business side of the operation with the precise practicality she had developed in the hard years alone, and the combination of her administrative intelligence and Abel's practical and legal knowledge made the McCrae Ranch an operation that people in Harlan's Crossing pointed to as an example of what could be built with work and principle. In 1891, Nora went to Santa Fe for her schooling, and the house was quieter without her, though Thomas and Alina filled a substantial amount of the available noise. She came back in summers and at Christmas, and she came back with drawings and ideas and an energy that she had gotten from her mother, that particular quality of a person who knows what they want and is not deterred from it. On a summer afternoon, Thomas, who was 6, asked his father how he had come to live at their ranch, and Abel looked at Alberta, who was sitting on the porch shelling beans and listening, and told the story straight through Harlan's Crossing, the boardwalk, the barrel outside the feed store, stepping out of the crowd, everything. Thomas listened with the gravity of a 6-year-old processing something important, and when the story was done he said, "So you didn't know Mama at all?" "Not at all," Abel said, "but you helped anyway." "Yes," Thomas thought about this. "Because it was right." "Because it was right," Abel confirmed. Thomas nodded with the slow certainty of a child who has just filed something away as a permanent piece of knowledge about how the world should work. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing, apparently satisfied. Alberta looked at Abel over the bean shells and the afternoon light and the vast sky above the New Mexico landscape, and she thought about a woman standing in a doorway with flour on her hands and fury in her eyes, and the man who had stepped out of a crowd to stand beside her, and everything that had followed from that single act of principle, the land that was still hers, the children in the yard, the life that had grown from the rootstock of that moment. She thought about Thomas Fletcher, who had built the original foundations and who deserved to be remembered as part of all this. She thought about the hard winters and the lonely nights and the letters from the territorial court and Pete and Callum leaving, and the way that all of those things, navigated without surrender, had led here. She thought about carrying things carefully, the deed in the tin box under the floorboard, the ring in a shirt pocket for 8 years, and about how the things you carried carefully were the things that mattered. Abel was watching her from the other porch chair with the warm directness that was as much a part of her daily life as the morning coffee and the sound of the river in the distance. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm glad you were sitting on that barrel outside the feed store," she said. "So am I," he said. He reached over and took one of the unshelled bean pods from the pile and began shelling it, because there was work to do and he had never been a man who sat idle while there was work to do. "So am I." Alina came running around the corner of the house at high speed with Thomas in pursuit, both of them apparently involved in some urgency that required the full use of their legs, and the porch shook slightly with the impact of small feet on the steps, and the evening was coming on with its slow amber light, and the river was running cold and clear along the southern edge of their land, and the mountains in the east held their purple shadow against the darkening sky, and everything that mattered was here, in this place. On this evening, on this land that had been fought for and held. Alberta shelled her beans, and Abel shelled his, and the children's noise was the sound of a life that was whole, and the future stretched out ahead of them like the territory itself, wide and full of light, properly theirs.